The nations that we have date back to the early colonial period. And the oldest ones are all on the eastern and southern rims of our nation, including, of course, the Spanish-American borderlands being the first of the Euro-American nations. They date back that far, and they date back to the fact that the initial colonial clusters that were placed on the continent were placed there by people from very different parts of the British Isles, or of the Netherlands, or of France, or of Spain, who each came with distinct ethnographic and religious and political goals in mind, with different ideals, indeed with different intents. They knew that at the time. They weren't all coming, of course, to found a unitary American state. They were coming to found specific individual societies. You see that reflected in some of our history textbooks, but somehow the fact that we came out of that is lost when people get rolled up into the revolutionary period. I mean, people now try to go back to that Founding Fathers time when we have, crises of unity, and we want to go back and found those founding principles that we all agreed on to overcome our divisions. The problem is the Founding Fathers in 1776 of 1789, that's the wrong generation. You're showing up at the intermission of the story of our country and trying to figure things out. The real Founding Fathers are those people's grandfathers, or great-grandfathers, or great-great-grandfathers, depending on where we're talking about, and they all came with different ideals and intents. And very briefly, in almost a comic book fashion, I will try to roll them out.
They're all going to read the book. So.
You all read the book, and then all the nuances and flavor and caveats will all become clear. This is a history that begins at the beginning and brings us to the present, so I really go through all the nuances and things that will jump into your head. But very briefly, Yankeedom, the greater New England cultural sphere, founded by, as a radical utopian religious experiment by Calvinists. The key thing to know about that is, from the beginning, the idea was that you could perfect earthly society and make it more godly. So from the beginning, it was an emphasis on social engineering as a project, and the ability for public institutions to somehow make the world better, and that there should be individual self-denial for the community's good, which in many ways is a very un-American idea elsewhere, but for Yankees is part and parcel. New Netherland, just a little further south, founded by the Dutch as like the Amsterdam in the early 1600s, it was founded as a global trading society with an enormous emphasis on freedom of inquiry and conscience. Midlands comes out of the Penn's Quaker experiments in Philadelphia, and the Quakers had an idea that everybody had an inner light, and that mankind was fundamentally good, and this led them, among other things, to open up their immigration policy to let anybody come in. So it essentially became, from the beginning, a multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural place, a mosaic where no one group was particularly in charge. That was the model, that idea that we're pluralistic, and that American identity is about the fact that we created a space where peoples would live next to each other. Again, that's one of the ideals you hear, but that's specific to the Midlands. Tidewater, down in the Chesapeake country, which we stand adjacent to right now, was founded by the younger sons of English gentry in the second half of the 17th century. The model was to recreate English manorial feudalism. They did so quite well, but it created a culture that had a great emphasis on respect for authority and hierarchy, and not a lot of emphasis on equality and political participation by sort of the commoners. Very different from New England, where it was community-based and every town had to have a town meeting to intentionally deflect the possibility an aristocracy would ever form. In Tidewater, they embraced the idea of aristocracy. Greater Appalachia, that highland zone, founded by settlers from Ulster and the Scots lowlands and the English marches, war-torn places, often anarchical, where you couldn't count on rule of law, and you had a warrior culture where you had to protect yourself and your own by your own means often, has a strong commitment to personal sovereignty and individual liberty and freedom, and avoiding encumbrances on the same. The Deep South was founded very differently from Yankeedom. It's the sort of opposite of the two superpowers that have ended up forming coalitions and fighting many of the great internal battles on our continent. The Deep South was founded by Barbadian planters, English planters from the island of Barbados, as specifically a West Indies slave society, with a republic modeled on the ancient republics of the classical world, of Greece and Rome, where democracy was the privilege of a small oligarchy, and people were born into slavery, and that was the natural course of things. In fact, they believed that a republic could not possibly survive in any other form. This carried through, of course, with great tragedy in our history, and on after the Civil War into a formally based racial caste system that was dismantled only within our lifetimes of many of the people in this room. New France, briefly, the mixing of Ancien Regime, Northern French peasantry's folkways with those of the Aboriginal people they met in the St. Lawrence Valley, resulting in a commitment to multiculturalism and an endless negotiation between groups. Negotiated settlements and negotiations that continue in a circle without end. The whole idea is to continue the negotiating process, and this idea, since New France has, after the Quiet Revolution, has emerged to control its own affairs, has infected the Canadian Federation's broader thinking on a federal level and its commitment to multiculturalism. El Norte, we've spoken about briefly, the obviously Spanish borderlands. I think we've touched on that. Far west, one of the two hybrid second-generation nations that were created by the others. The last one to finally be settled. It's the one place where environment trumped ethnography, because in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century when it was founded, the conditions were so extreme, remoteness, aridity, the enormous altitude, that the folkways of these cultures as they spread could not cope with it. They actually couldn't plant their crops and have them succeed. The only way to survive, by and large, with the exception of the Mormon enclave, was to attach yourself to massive deployment of industrial capital that was able to overcome those impediments in the 19th century. Railways, ore smelters, irrigation, dams, which could only be provided by large external companies, corporations external to the far west or the federal government. This resulted in it being an internal colony where colonization had been directed by these entities, and there's been resentment ever since of both the federal government and the outsiders who have exploited the region as a resource colony ever since, that affects the politics to this day. And finally, the left coast, well, almost finally the left coast, the coastal fringe there, the difference with the far west, founded earlier by two groups of people. Yankees who arrived from the sea, often led in a missionary impulse to save the Pacific coast to become another New England. There was going to be another light on the hill, another New Zion, and it had to be saved promptly from the menace of all the other groups. The Pope was going to come and his Catholic minions would destroy everything. They were there founding places like Berkeley and trying to fight to create a new New England. They were thwarted by the gold rush and the arrival of a large number of settlers, generally overland, who were concentrated in the Appalachian Midwest in their points of origin, created a fusion culture. The left coast combines the utopianism and belief in the possibility of sort of social reform of Yankeedom with the emphasis on individual self-discovery and actualization that comes from the Appalachian tradition. It's been staggeringly fecund and has led it to be the center of most of the high-tech companies you can possibly imagine in your head.